Okay, hi. My name is Johanna Mitchell, and I will be going over my capstone defense project. This is the title of it. It's the integration of past themes in contemporary confessional poetry. What is confessional poetry? Basically, how I came up with this project is I realized a lot through my creative writing classes throughout college that confessional poetry was what I was most interested in above all other genres. And I knew that I needed to do something with it for my capstone project. Anyway, kind of a background to confessional poetry. Basically, before confessional poetry came along, most poetry was written at a distance, and most poets only wrote about themselves through ironic or hidden language, never directly discussing their own experiences. And this includes some of the greatest poets known today, such as Walt Whitman, William Blake, and then my personal favorite, Anne Bradstreet. So it also it wasn't until the confessionalists came around in the mid 20th century that they created this removal of the mask in the world of poetry, which basically is confessional poets creating a new autobiographical genre that focuses on talking about one's personal lives and even the parts of people that people aren't usually open to talking about or being vulnerable about. I guess more taboo topics they decided to talk about within confessional poetry. So, going along with this, the confessional themes that emerged then were death, trauma, mental illness, and relationships. Although as the genre grew more and progressed over time, more themes came about, such as sex, addiction, abuse, and parenthood. So, for my research project, I will be constructing a chapbook of 15 to 20 poems of my own confessional poetry. But before I'm going to do this, I am going to conduct a lot of research on other confessional poets and how they take themes and experiences in their own lives and then put it into writing or create poetry from them. So, my question I came up with then is how can developing an understanding of the use of themes in past confessional poetry be used to craft confessional poetry in this contemporary age? Um, I also decided to go with just three methods of research. And these are, so the first one is how writers contend with their themes. By this, I will try to find out what poets have to say about their own themes, not only within their own poems, but in interviews or journal entries. And then the main reason I wanted to do this is because I think looking into other poets' relationships with their themes is I thought it was going to help me, and it did end up helping me create a better understanding of my own themes that I would use within my poetry. The second method of research is how themes are integrated into poetry collections as a whole. And then with this, I was studying how often certain themes are used, how they're combined, and how they work to establish an overarching theme associated within poetry collections. My last one then, it is how confessional themes are rendered into imagery. And for this, I chose to look into how different poets choose to convey their themes and what images they use to do so. I also paid attention to the flexibility of these themes as well throughout the progression of different collections. All right. These are some of the most well-known confessional poets. I thought I should just mention their names. Sylvia Plath, Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, and then today, as a contemporary poet, Ada Limon is one of the most well-known today. All right, so the first poet I decided to research in depth was Sylvia Plath, who is probably the most well-known poet today. Um, so her usual themes within her writing include death, destruction, mental illness, and womanhood. Because both death and womanhood are themes I use within my own poetry, I chose to focus on just them for my research. Otherwise, I think my project would have turned out to be much longer than I intended. So how she contends with death and womanhood. Starting with death, because Plath's father died when she was young, she had a close relationship with death for most of her life. In her writing, in her journal entries, she describes it as something, I guess, following her, awaiting her. She often even writes of it as a fantasy. Um, and then, like, while her relationship with death was used as a theme to produce some of her best poems, it also unfortunately played a part in her committing suicide at the age of 30. So that was just how she contended with that as a theme, as a person and as a writer. When it comes to womanhood, it's not surprising that it plays a big role in Plath's writing because she was a radical feminist for her time. She often rejected the standards for women back then, and often wrote about how she was disgusted and upset with the gender roles for women at the time. This is obvious in a lot of her writing, especially her famous quote, "It becomes obvious." She says, "Girls are not machines that you put kindness coins into until the sex falls out." So, moving on to my second method of research, so how death and womanhood are integrated into her poetry collections. For death, it had always been a theme within her writing, even when she first started her journal entries and her first poems as a child. And even when it isn't the main focus of a poem itself, it's usually still often referenced just through the symbolic language that she uses. For womanhood, unlike death, it didn't begin to appear significantly until her later collections of poems, most likely because she was experiencing womanhood for the first time then as a wife and a mother, both of which she really had a hard time conforming to. Um, and then, so these themes are actually, they also often appear in the same poems in a sort of combination where death or depression is combined with Plath's intense struggle to fulfill her role as a woman. And then some of her greatest pieces actually feature this exact combination. And we see that in a lot of her later works. For my third category of research surrounding Plath, how death and womanhood are rendered into imagery, there was no like one specific image that Plath uses for either theme, because that would have been just too limiting for her writing. However, there are some images associated with just death, and these are death painted as a night sky, a space or void, which devours humans with its darkness and nothingness. Sometimes it's also associated with blood, ingestion, illness, or a general devouring force within her poetry. For womanhood, some of the common images that are associated with it are the moon, sun, clouds, flatness, redness, and whiteness. And she also often writes of mannequins in a few of her poems too, in relation to the objectification of women. All right, moving on to my next poet of research. I went with Adrienne Rich. So, after moving to New York and losing her husband, Adrienne Rich wrote her best works of poetry, most of which they included overarching themes of female empowerment and gender identity. Those are the themes I decided to specifically focus on because I found that they were the most prominent within a lot of her poetry. So when it comes to how she contends with these, to Rich, the themes of female empowerment and gender identity are really rooted in anger. Like Plath, she was a feminist ahead of her time, fighting against the typical gender roles assigned to both men and women. But she used this anger in her poetry, often using her poems as, I guess you could say, messages for the American people, meant to evoke social reform and equality for all genders, not only at the time, but also, and she references this in her poems, she hoped for them to be messages for all women and all genders in the future as time progressed. When it comes to how she integrates female empowerment and gender identity into her collections, both of the themes, they really appear from the beginning in her writing to the end of it. In her most famous collection, Diving into the Wreck, the whole entire book is really based around this shipwreck that serves as a metaphor for the gender expectations in society at the time, with men being in power. In these poems, she offers future ideas of how to deal with this wreck. On every page, she pretty much ties female empowerment and gender identity together, while also offering feminism as the most common solution to it all, which I thought was really cool. So lastly, how how female empowerment and gender identity are rendered into imagery. Like Plath, there was no like specific image associated with either theme because it would be too limiting. But one way that she renders female empowerment into imagery is by painting women as non-traditional gender roles. Such in one poem, she even paints out a woman to appear to a man as a neurosurgeon in his dreams, which really confuses him because obviously back then that was not a usual job that a woman would be able to attain, or lifestyle in general. She also uses powerful images such as burning wood in her poem Song, or purple lightning to portray female empowerment, just these really like strong, vivid images that are meant to evoke change. At other points, she also uses images with negative connotations to demonstrate the horror and pain of current gender roles. Um, and then, so that kind of ties into gender identity, the other theme. And so for gender identity, Rich uses the scenario of a physical disaster or wreck to convey it. She also uses haunting images such as spider webs, melting ice cubes, or a black pool that slowly hardens into volcanic rock. While portraying it as well. In other poems, she also uses hopeful imagery to paint a picture of change for gender identity in the future. And some of these include characters within her poems or speakers within her poems talking about dreams of the future, or also just eyes metaphorically opening and viewing gender as something that is not so black and white or binary in society, which I thought was super cool. All right, my last poet of research is Kim Adamsio, which I have studied in a lot of my classes throughout college. So for Adamsio, she is a contemporary and confessional poet like myself, and she's also still alive today, unlike the other two that I studied. And for her, she had a lot of themes, a wide variety of them, but I found that her most prominent were the themes of love and sex as kind of a single theme tied together, and then also mental health and mental illness. So when it comes to how she contends with love, sex, and mental health, because she's still alive today, there weren't a lot of options for me to read through journal entries or any type of autobiographical works published about her, because obviously those aren't really written while most poets or celebrities are still alive. So a lot of what I gathered about how she contends with these themes is just mainly through interviews that she has. And in these, she often speaks openly about her lifelong struggle with depression, and then how she relies on drugs and sex to cope with it a lot, which is definitely something we see within her poetry. However, she did also mention that sex can be used for other things. With her, she believes that sex holds the power of like a spiritual connection, and it also often acts as like a full, vivid portrayal of love, or a love that humans share. Because of this, so when we come across sex within her poetry, we know that it most likely holds a lot more meaning than what meets the eyes, and that she usually uses it as more of a spiritual or often metaphysical act. Okay, so when it comes to how she integrates these themes into her collections, all of them have really existed within her writing from when she first was a poet until now. However, she didn't really become a confessional poet or develop very much of a confessional voice until her later collections, like following her graduation from the University of San Francisco with a master's degree. That was when she finally felt like she could be vulnerable about these subjects and honest, and she really just nailed down that confessional voice. Love, sex, and mental health, so they do appear separately in many poems, but some of Adamsio's strongest pieces feature this combination of all of them. So, for example, she often ties in the theme of mental health with love and sex by writing about how her depression is a common cause of the relationship ending, or even her getting into unhealthy relationships in the first place. Throughout a lot of the poems that she writes, she tackles the topic of wanting to be saved from her own despair. And she also like suggests that she relies heavily on substance abuse, love, and sex as outlets for her own mental health. So just this kind of like pain, and then love and sex being the solution to the pain that comes with mental illness. She uses those often to create some of her most well-known pieces today. So when it comes to how they are rendered into imagery, Adamsio, so something that I thought was super cool and something I come across with when it comes to contemporary poets is that so she writes with a more conversational tone in her poems, and this is a technique to appeal more to the contemporary reader today, especially like our younger generations. As we're always on our phone using technology, we definitely stray away from some of the more symbolic language that was used in the past. And so because of this, there's not as many consistent images for each theme, which I thought was interesting, but also just a new way to keep up with the times and appeal to writers. For mental health, she writes her images based more on feelings associated with mental health. So at one point, she uses aliens to portray the foreign feeling of getting better from her sadness, often feeling like this outsider in her new healthy lifestyle. And just this foreign feeling of feeling better when all that she had known was sadness and despair for so long. Another image used to portray feelings of mental health is in her poem The Singing. There is a crying bird that she hears even after it's gone, and this symbolizes like lingering depression in her life that she feels is always with her, that she always listens to and hears, and essentially it prevents her from ever finding true happiness. When it comes to love and sex as images within her writing, for love and sex, one of the most common images that exists between the two is water. In one poem, Mermaid Song, it's Adamsio's daughter who resembles a mermaid. She just paints her, personifies her as like this mermaid specimen that actually ends up saving Adamsio from drowning in her own sorrow in the poem. In another poem, too, The Flood, she writes about a flood that symbolizes the powerful and captivating feeling that floods over her while having intercourse. So that was how she renders those into imagery and contends with those themes. And it was really interesting to study her in comparison to the beginning confessional poets and see how the integration of her themes differs in the way that we create contemporary writing today. And it also, of course, helped me in constructing my own chapbook. So while I originally intended for the chapbook to be closer to 20 poems, I actually ended up having 15 short and complete poems. And yeah, I feel like out of all the poets that I studied, it was actually Adamsio who had the biggest effect because I mainly strive to mimic her language. And the way that she uses more of a conversational, like clean-cut tone to her poems in order to be more appealing to readers. So choosing my themes, I ended up going with just two main themes, and they were mental health and female empowerment. And so, like, after much reflection on my own life, going on lots of hikes, doing a lot of thinking, and just like considering the parts that I'm usually not as open to sharing about, I guess. I ventured through and thought a lot about what I wanted to write and my personal struggle with depression from a long age, sexual assault, and female objectification. I knew that I wanted to take these and write about them, not just for myself, but for other people, and to like hopefully one day have other people take something away from my poems. So even though these things were hard to write about, they were something that I really wanted to write about, which is where I came about the themes of mental health or illness and female empowerment for a majority of my chapbook. So when it comes to how I turned these into poetry, it wasn't ever really like clean and clear process of how I did so. Um, I guess what I found was like when it came to images for the use of mental health alone, I often chose images that focused on change or evolving, or I guess you could say like molting over the course of a poem, since I talk about reptiles a lot. In one poem, even, the speaker is a tadpole that grows into a frog as it learns to croak for itself. In another poem, I describe my body decomposing into the earth with all of my childhood vitamins so that flowers can bloom for my mom. And then yeah, so like many of the main themes within the confessional poets I studied, a lot of my poems actually feature a combination of mental health and female empowerment through my imagery. So they both also work to kind of convey like this loss of innocence as well, which I thought was really interesting. And then yeah, one combination that appears is in my poem, The Reincarceration of Medusa, where I compare myself to a molting snake as I shed behind past traumas and become this new empowered woman. In another poem, Flush, these themes are linked through the metaphor of young girls hatching from their childhood as all kinds of different birds, but being forced into the lifestyle of delicate and ladylike flamingos. With this, I focus on the toll that feminine expectations have on women, and in the end, I call for a change to occur or for women to break free from their cages and rewrite the myth of femininity. And I will actually be reading this poem specifically. So here it is. It's Flush. When young girls turn 12, they begin to peel off their childhood in pieces like cracked eggshell and sprout womanhood all over their bodies. But before we learn to speak, singing questions, mouths like loosened beaks, we fall quiet to the answers whispered from our ancestors. It doesn't matter if we are birthed bulky, broad-shouldered, winter-fuzzed baby head, red-bellied, bearing the colors of sunset or moonrise, set to sing songs for strangers paving across pavements. We will only dream the dream of flamingos, delicate and ladylike, dressed in feathers as pink as a petal, never remembered for our flight, but the curve of our neck, the softness of our caw, long legs careful and cautious in every movement. Those who resist often die a retriever's prize. Others shadow into blackbirds disguised in the night, whose call is soundless in the woods with no one to hear it. Many still fight loudly with bruised wings, lusting for the sky from cages, where they sit, dreaming of the day we rewrite the myth. A female phoenix will rise from the ashes only when men are no longer holding the matches. So yeah, this poem basically, it's probably more than any other poem, like strongly focuses on womanhood and female empowerment, and I kind of wrote it even as just this message to young girls, or a message to middle school me that I wish I could have read and understood back then. The Reincarceration of Medusa. So this is a poem that really captures that combination of mental health and female empowerment as themes, twisted together to also just paint a general loss of innocence as well. So the Reincarceration of Medusa. After you, I felt a compulsion to clean. De-stitching your hairs from the carpet fibers, scraping your boot sand from the car floor, your handprints from my front door. I washed my sheets several times through with lavender, but still they smelled of you. I repainted the walls of my room eggshell white to symbolize new beginnings, but at night I'd open my eyes to an asylum, your words scattering my brain like mice trapped in a terrarium, the burn of your fingers crawling my skin like loose crickets roasting beneath a heat lamp. The groggy weight of my eyelids heavied with venom over time, but I kept them open long enough to read the words. The average life of a body cell is 7 years, which means one day I'd regenerate and wake at 22 as a woman you never touched. I thought of this nightly, sitting in a bathtub in the darkness, the water warm and amniotic against my skin as I scrubbed it down into the soft and velvet wick of snake scales. I imagined slipping from my girl body and molting into a lady coated in cobra black leather jackets. I'd walk only with a dry, dreadful purr in my hips, and through the hiss of my words and the quick flicker of spit on my tongue, I would make men like you quiver. In the blood-red tint of my lips, I'd smile, knowing I won't make the mistake of Medusa, who commemorated her offenders into statues. No, I'll take the sharp black ink of a pen and slither your name across blank pages endlessly until everyone knows your blunder, until you choke on the truth of your actions, until the venom of regret permeates your veins, and as your mind and body break into war, you are left as lonely as you made me so many years before.